I was named after a biblical king. King Hiram was king of a kingdom called Tyre. And he actually had a really close relationship with King David. You know, like he would send him materials for the building of temples, right? So, and I'm sure perhaps even that time, you know, maybe they were exchanging some poetry too.
In 2013, you published Photõetry. You collaborated with 5 photographers. I believe you sent poems to these photographers, and they did photographs based on the poems, and also you wrote poems based on some photography. So there was like a dialogue between photography and poetry. And the book is basically a love letter to the city or the area of South Central LA.
Yeah.
It's a very realistic portrait of South Central LA, but I think what you do, and keeping with the photography metaphor, I think you open the lens so we see a more complex, a more diverse city, or a more complex South Central LA. There are many poems I like in the book, but I would like you to read one called "The Wrong Red Shirt."
In high school, round about 15 years old, round Western and Exposition Boulevard, I ran across a busy South Central street with a red Hawaiian shirt tied around my waist, on my way to get my mama a hamburger. I am not Hawaiian, never been there, never smelled there, never seen there, but because it was red, a very noticeable red, someone noticed me. I bought the red shirt to fit in, to blend in, to never be noticed, but it didn't work. That boy, dressed in a grown man's aggression, ran over to me, hand under shirt, and said in a tone that meant I might die today, "Where are you from?" I knew what he meant. If I was sarcastic, I would have said Hawaii. If I was conscious, I would have said West Africa. If I was deep, I would have said God's fingers, but I was smart and very afraid. And I said what I should have said to a young Crip looking for trouble. Nowhere. He let me go. And to this day, I never wear red, nor do I want to be noticed by anyone.
Your first book, published in 2008, is an anthology. It has around 15 poets you call urban poets. And I also believe it was originated in a workshop that you did. So I would like you to go for a moment to that time and to tell me about the motivation behind Write or Die.
I was in college. I was about 21 years old, and I realized that I wanted to be a poetry professor. I had a great poetry professor named David St. John, who actually has done this interview series. And I started to spend more time with him and pay attention to the way that he conducted his class. And so I knew that I wanted to teach creative writing, but I know it would be years before anyone paid me to do it. So I started a workshop in my living room called the Urban Poets. We would start every workshop by watching an episode of a television show called Deaf Poetry. And then we would do, I would give them an exercise. We'd do a short writing exercise, and then people would bring poems they had written. And then at the end of every workshop, we would take another 10 minutes and we would write a rap. And then we would like go around and, like do the rap for each other. And so at the end of that year, I realized we had written a lot of work and could put a book together. And so I asked the poets in the workshop to each give me 10 pages of poetry. And I formatted the book on Microsoft Word and uploaded it to a website called lulu.com. And then had a friend of mine do the art on the cover of the book. And right at that time, there was a rapper named, at the time, his name was like Puff Daddy or P. Diddy, very famous guy. And there was an election, and he made these T-shirts, "Vote or Die." And I was like, that's really cool. So that's why I decided to name the book "Write or Die," right? Because I feel like writers have to get their stories out, on paper, their poetry out, or something within them starts to corrupt, something within them starts to decay, right?
Was it easy to find like the support to publish that, or because you were unknown in the
Yes.
poetry communities?
Most publishers would say that that's backwards, right? That you should first get fans and, perhaps publish individual poems and then put out a whole collection of work, right? But that doesn't happen all the time. So once the book was created, then we thought it, important to get out in the community and read it to people. So we set up these readings at open mics, college classrooms, wherever people would listen to us, we would go and read. Long Beach City College, I remember we did a great show there. So I feel like for many writers, including us being very young poets at that time, the book was a reason, right? Like to go out and share the poetry with the public and basically create a show or an experience that will make people connect with the book.
Your first poem or your first poems were a response to poems that you heard or you read in church, specifically the poems of the Book of Psalms. And you describe that language as didactic lyric speech.
Psalms has the most poetic language of all the other books in the Bible. So, like my mother started bringing me to church when I was like 6 weeks old. So in my opinion, like that is the first poetry that I heard, right? And as I grew older and fell more in love with the Psalms, I started to realize that these poems by King David are an expression of faith, but also an expression of fear, right? As I read more of them, because, he was, afraid that people were going to encroach upon his kingdom.
Do you recognize other movements or other influences in your writing?
I'm very much influenced by a lot of the Harlem Renaissance poets, Count Cullen, Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, who's not always put in that group, but I feel like to me he kind of represents that time period. But even going back further, Phyllis Wheatley, like publishing her first book and her story. And so I think I'm always in love with poets who are writing about the Black experience in America, Nikki Giovanni, Gwendolyn Brooks.
Something I like about your poetry and is I find it very inclusive. I know inclusive is probably a very overused term right now, but in your case, when I say inclusive, because there's spirituality, there is religion, there is activism. It's a very realistic poetry, but at the same time, it's aspirational. I think you are able to connect with young people, the young generation of poets, but at the same time, you also reflect poets of the past, more established. And there is one poem that you have about County Cullen that is a poet, part of the Harlem Renaissance. And I would like you to read that poem.
And I'll just say before I read it that Count Cullen is just one of my favorite poets and a major influence on my life, being a Harlem Renaissance poet, but also being someone who loved meter. He loved to write poems in, iambic pentameter, trochaic tetrameter, spondies, anapaests, dactyls. Like he loved rhythm, and I love rhythm too. So this is to him. And he wrote a poem called To John Keats at Springtime. And John Keats was a major influence on him. And so County Cullen being a major influence on me. To Countee Cullen on the eve of summer. I cannot hold my peace, Countee. You ever leave me wanting more. I tip my hat and bow my knee to you, my shining troubadour. A black man writing lovely verse despite the horror of his time. A blacksmith melting stony hearts with all the tenor of his rhyme. Countee, I too must bear this sin. A poet and an African, a sentence born of bonded fates. The scorn from these United States does haunt me. I too bear the mark of those whose skin and pen is dark. I bid you sing from earth's dark grave. I bid you write from soil's black cave. I bid you push through clay, my friend, and pour your verse into the wind that I may feel it on my face, the beauty of our humble race in sentences where all may find the truth and grace of humankind. Though death has blinded you, I see your poems move across this land. Though now your palms be dust, I see the pen and chisel in your hand. Cullen is dead, they say, but I, who hear your full insistent cry in bud and blossom, leaf and tree, know Countee still writes poetry.
You also have had mentors. You mentioned David St. John, but
Yes.
I think you also have worked with Kamau Daoud and Peter Harris and Lynn Thompson and Connie Williams.
A lot of those people have either directly or indirectly influenced me. Kamau Daoud, especially because he created a place called the World Stage in Leimert Park, and him and Billy Higgins. And the reason why that influence is so strong on me is because that was really where I discovered a lot of the L.A. poets once I went to that space and really fell in love with that space and fell in love with the people there. They gave me a different education, right? So I would say my education begins at USC when it comes to creative writing. And I think they taught me a lot about form and structure and, like the power of workshopping your pieces. But when I went to the World Stage, that education was about how to communicate your work to the people, right? And how to capture an audience with your work and how to avoid boring people with your work.
Could it be possible for you to read one more poem from the book? It's on page 48. It's called Trabajo.
I am weary. My eyelids sag down like tulips after their prime, ready to collapse after a long but short life of standing up all day and all night. Don't I have a right to be tired? No, I don't work the hot, sweltering cotton fields like my ancestors did. No, I don't clean tubs and scrub floors like my ancestors did. No, I don't spend 12 hours a day picking coal out of a mountain like my ancestors did, but I'm still weary. I'd like to think they endured their profound weariness so that I could sit here and do almost nothing all day and still be tired. We all work. We all grow weary. but some of us have more of a right to be weary than others, even though all of us toil in the office, in the street, in the library, at this computer, in our homes, in the fields, and within ourselves. I am not one of the hard workers who deserves to be weary, but I do work and I am tired.
I wanted you to read this poem because you are a very active person. I made a list of all the projects you have started and all the collaborations you have done. So I'm gonna do a little list of all the work you do, all the trabajo you do. And so you right now you teach at the Los Angeles Film School, but you have also worked in other institutions like State L.A., Long Beach City College. You are the founder of the Community Literature Initiative. Did you start that in 2013? Is that right?
Yes, only 2 months after my book came out. Wow. Maybe 3 months. And so I started going to sell my book, and I was going to open mics, and I realized there were all these amazing poets, but none of them had books. And at that point I had learned how to make them, so I wanted to create a program and a class that could teach them how to finish a manuscript and then how to convert that manuscript into a published work.
You teach a workshop called, it's a publishing class at the World Stage.
For the first month, we were there at the World Stage, and then we realized we needed a projector and a screen and all. And then USC gave us the classroom space. So then we moved over there.
You also work with Connie Williams for the World Stage Press. And then the latest project I know of is the Sims Library of Poetry. This is a library that right now has around 5,000 poetry books.
The Sims Library of Poetry started in a $30 suitcase that I bought from Ross. And so what happened was I was teaching my classes at USC for the Community Literature Initiative, and I made it a requirement that the students read one book of poetry every week. And none of them were doing it. Like none of them. And so I asked them why, and they all said, we don't know where to get poetry books. We don't know where to find them. And so I had, probably about 200 or 300 poetry books at my house. So I put 60 of them in a suitcase, and then I would wheel that suitcase into class every Monday night. And at the end of class, I would unzip it, open it up, and I was like, take a book, and then if you borrowed one last week, put it back, right? So it was a lending library suitcase, right? And so one of my students said, "Oh, this is the little Sims Library of Poetry right here," and I was like, "Yeah, I like that name," So many years later, I had a vision for an actual library, but, without a whole lot of resources. I had this very nice garage, and so I started, I built one bookshelf out of just scrap wood, and it looked really nice, and I put it in my house, and it worked. And I put the poetry books on it. When I say it worked, I mean it did not fall over, right? So I was like, I can build bookshelves. So I looked in my garage, 2-car garage, empty, or just full of regular crap. So I built these wraparound bookshelves, right, in that garage, and it could those shelves could probably hold, about 2,000 books, So when I put my little 200 books on it, it looked really empty, right? So I had a birthday party scheduled, and I said, I'm going to have a poetry reading and I'm just going to ask every poet I know to come donate books of poetry, and we'll build a little library in my garage. Because at that time, students were also coming to my house to borrow books. And other poets, you know, like people would call me and say, "Hey, do you have this?" And I'd be like, "Yep." And they'd be like, "Do you have any, you know, Langston Hughes?" "Yeah, got a lot of it." "Do you have any Shakespeare?" "Got it." Right? Whatever they say, you know, I had it. So, so me and my students together created that version of the Sims Library of Poetry. So on one side were all the books. On the other side, we built a little computer lab that could hold about 3 computers. And then we actually did this on the day of my birthday. We built a stage, you know, just out of 2x10s. And
so was this still all in your garage, you say?
Yeah, my garage and my backyard.
Okay.
So the one in my garage, so like I said, but I still only had like 300 books in compared to all that shelf space. And so we had a big poetry reading, like 12 poets came and read, but many more poets came to donate. And all these poets would also write lines of poetry on the wall in my garage. People like Connie Williams, Kamal came, V. Kali came, S. Pearl came. All these great, amazing, prolific poets came to donate books. And 7 months later, well, maybe a little bit before that, I told my students, like, "Hey, we want to build a real library. Like, this little library in my garage is nice, but the vision is to have a real place." And so, so we had set out to create this place together, to find a building we could move into. And we weren't really having much traction. Then the pandemic hit, and it became even less important, right? Because now everybody's trying to survive. And then my wife had a preschool, and she had to close it because of the pandemic. She couldn't watch the kids in it. So she said, "I'm closing the preschool. Would you like to move your library into the preschool?" And that was an amazing gift, an amazing blessing. Because it's like 1,800 square feet, you know, like indoor space, outdoor space. And so then right around June, we began the process of moving into that space.
And are you open for donations?
Yes, we are. So people can donate books, or they can donate money for books at simslibraryofpoetry.org.
Okay.
Yeah, and so, but this place is dedicated to, you know, the reading, the writing, the study, and performance of poetry. And we have book stacks, but we also have a performance space. We have a reading lounge. We have a computer lab where people can, you know, listen to poetry. We have a digital catalog. Me and my friend used to always say that poetry is homeless. You know, like we sleep on people's couches for a little bit and then we get kicked out, right? But I was like, this place is going to be a home.
You have been active in the Los Angeles poetry community for a long time. So you started as a teenager, I believe. So could you tell me like a couple of big changes you have seen in the poetry world of Los Angeles in the last years?
Those of us who fall in love with this activity, that activity being defined as like going out, you know, like to read and perform poems. Eventually we start to create programs, you know, classes, you know, so that's really what I see consistently. I see like the evolution of a person, you know, reflected in the evolution of opportunities that are created for those people. You know, there's so many poetry organizations that are popping up. You know, Women Who Submit is one that comes to mind.
Right, yes, yes.
One of my former students, Davina, she created a poetry publishing program for Latina writers. We seem to want to do the things that we see. that we saw when we started, you know, like people creating venues for people to read. I've actually seen, you know, an explosion of poets publishing books in LA, you know, because I think what we figured out is that poetry is a craft and bookmaking is a craft.
To end the conversation, the poem New Psalm, that is also from your book, Photõetry.
New Psalm 6. O Lord, creator of all things valuable, make in me a poet, a craftsman of pen and paper, an orator of thoughts written, then spoken, your connoisseur of love and pain captured on 8.5 by 11 template, yielding the great contrast of my time, black and white. Let me make gray with my fingers and leave my signature on words that were yours all along. Others you granted this wish. David, Solomon, Maya, Sylvia, Langston, Gwendolyn, Pablo. I come to you now just as unworthy as those who came before me, but with the same willingness to forsake prosperity for one or two poems that someone will remember. O Lord, creator of all things unforgettable, make me a poet.
Thank you very much for your time and for reading the poems, and thank you for being part of the Poetry.LA interviews, and good luck with all your projects.
All right, thank you.